Welcome to another episode of Got Time with Christopher John, your scholar and gentleman in a hoodie. Please know your subscription and support is needed and appreciated. Be sure to continue to share, subscribe, and support. Since 1893, when the title of ambassador first entered the American diplomatic vocabulary, there have been more than 3,500 Americans who have carried that title. Only 166 have been Black Americans. The first American ambassador of African descent was Edward Dudley. At the age of 38, he was appointed by President Harry Truman as minister to Liberia. Dudley was elevated to the rank of U.S. ambassador to Liberia in 1949. Ambassadors come from all walks of life, from the lecture hall and the boardroom, from elected office and the concert stage, from the pulpit, where the language of diplomacy and the language of the sermon aren't so far apart after all. Black ambassadors have led U.S. diplomatic delegations in more than 95 nations. They have represented U.S. interests before the United Nations and other international or regional organizations, and have led strategic initiatives to contest terrorism, prosecute war crimes, promote trade, and promote religious freedom. President George W. Bush and President Obama prioritized Black ambassadorial appointments. Bush with 45 appointments and Obama with 46, the most respectively and the most historically. Joining us is an American diplomat, academic leader, and clergyman who has served this country as ambassador. He holds a Bachelor's of Arts in Religious Studies from Trinity College, a Master's of Divinity from Duke University, and a Doctor of Ministry from Howard University, along with leadership training from Harvard and beyond. For 2 decades, he served as chaplain at Hampton University, teaching logic, scientific method, and religion in the same breath. From there, his leadership carried him through administrative roles at Virginia State University, Chicago State University, and the Interdenominational Theological Center, always emphasizing leadership, training, and community. He served 20 years in the U.S. Army Reserve as chaplain with the rank of lieutenant colonel. In 2009, President Obama called on him to serve as U.S. ambassador to the African Union, a post he held into 2013. And then in August of 2021, President Biden appointed him U.S. ambassador of Tanzania. During his tenure in Tanzania, he worked to strengthen bilateral trade, democratic governance, education, health, and youth engagement between our two nations. He has sat on boards spanning higher education, theological institutions, and community development. This year, he will receive the Global Lifetime Achievement Award for Diplomacy and Humanitarian Leadership. My frat brother, my former boss, and an upstanding man in every sense of the word, Dr. Michael A. Battle Sr. Thank you for coming to the table and making time for us, Dr. Battle.
Well, Chris, it's always an honor to talk with you, and just knowing that I'm in conversation with you makes the time worthy from my point of view. So I'm looking forward to a stimulating conversation led by questions. And as I often say to people who are interviewing me, ask difficult questions. That's your job.
Well, I'm going to ask them some difficult questions. I'm excited about this conversation as we talk about global citizenship. as we talk about global stewardship as well. And you are just the right person to do that. And so I want to begin from the beginning, if you don't mind. You grew up in St. Louis, Missouri. And so could you tell us a little bit or share a little bit about your upbringing in St. Louis?
Yeah. I grew up the son of a Pentecostal bishop in St. Louis, Missouri, one of 12 kids. Went to Sodan High School in St. Louis. Interestingly enough, that high school has produced two U.S. ambassadors to Tanzania. A young man, well, not so young, but a person who graduated from Sodan 2 years before I did, Charles Stitt, was the U.S. ambassador to Tanzania during the Clinton administration, and I was the U.S. ambassador to Tanzania during the Biden administration, and the two of us still have very close relationships. But Sodan was an interesting school. It provided for me the opportunity to be engaged not only in academic pursuit, but to be engaged intensely in international and global affairs. There were two major organizations at the school that focused on international and global affairs. One was Allied Youth, which I was a part of, extremely conservative, and the other was the Model United Nations, extremely liberal. And I was a part of both of those organizations because I wanted to create a balanced sense of the world. And I did not want to have a sense of the global community skewed by one orientation as opposed to having balance. So in my Model United Nations days, I made my first international speech focusing on African policy. And that was during the time that Ian Smith was the head of what was then Rhodesia, and which is now Zimbabwe. And Ian Smith's government was instituting a law that would require every African woman to be sterilized after the first child. Now, Ian Smith represented the white government in Rhodesia, which dominated Rhodesia during colonial years. And he, like most racists, was ignorant and arrogant enough to think that he could limit the number of Black people in an African country by imposing a draconian law that would insist upon the sterilization. So I was about 16 years old and got on the floor of the Model United Nations and was asked to address critical issues on the African continent. And I made my first speech addressing the inhumanity, the insanity, and indecency of the Ian Smith government in Rhodesia. And that speech got a lot of attention. And interestingly enough, much later on, I had the opportunity on a number of occasions to meet and have conversation with Robert Mugabe, who became the first Black president of what is now Zimbabwe. So my first speech, global speech, was against the white-led government of Rhodesia. And in my professional, political, and diplomatic career, I got to meet the first Black leader of free Zimbabwe.
Now, I have to ask this question. 16 years old, where does that, I would say, that type of audacity at 16 years old, where do you feel that is gleaned from? There's not a lot of 16-year-olds that are making an address at the UN. Although you talk about the high school you went to, but I'm just curious, what led you to have that type of wanting to have a balance of perspectives, but also just the audacity to be able to speak truth to power at such a young age?
Well, I grew up in a family with a father who was a minister, but very deeply politically active in the shaping of St. Louis, what became the shaping of of St. Louis in not only the Black community, but in the larger St. Louis community, which was at that time the Mill Creek region, which was going through massive renovation and massive renewal. And my father was one of the people who had been pegged by the city to be engaged in that. But more importantly, the church at that time encouraged, nudged, and sometimes even forced young people, men and women, boys and girls, to speak publicly.
Yes.
We had to speak publicly. And the interesting thing is, we were taught to speak publicly and to do so without saying aram, and all those kind of words, but to speak publicly for extensive periods of time without the filler language. And I think that gave me the courage and the audacity that Barack Obama later spoke about, to speak about critical issues even at the age of 16.
I can relate to that because I remember when I graduated from high school, and St. Paul Bethel Missionary Baptist Church, they required us as a senior to speak in the church, whether that was responsive reading. We were, growing up, absolutely. And I'm not quite sure if our churches are doing that, currently enough, I should say. But absolutely.
I think church is not only for religion. Church is to teach people about life. And life involves more than just the status of one's soul. Life involves the status of one's mind, of one's body, of one's integrity. And churches that are holistically oriented are concerned about the development that we have spiritually, mentally, financially, physically, and in every other aspect of what makes us human.
You're absolutely correct. I couldn't put it any better. I want to make this pivot to the importance of good foreign policy and diplomacy, because right now we're in a current time to where, frankly, foreign policy, diplomacy, it seems as if it's non-existent when we talk about the current administration and the current leaders we have in this nation. So can you speak, your perspective on the importance of good foreign policy and diplomacy and what it means for us, especially through the lens of the Black experience?
In my diplomatic years, I've worked in countries where you've had leadership in the past that looked at diplomacy as an enemy of the state. Unfortunately, in the US, we have an administration that looks at the State Department as a part of some ill-conceived notion of a deep state, as opposed to allowing diplomacy to do what diplomacy is designed to do, and that is to bring nations together to negotiate over long periods of time on creating peace moving forward. We have an administration now that focuses on transactional relationships, relationships that are based on whether or not a financial gain can be achieved, as opposed to a relationship based upon humanitarian orientation. If you look at some of the people, for example, who are leading the negotiations in Iran, people who are focused on fiscal gain as opposed to being focused on long-term peace and prosperity. The difference between what is now and what was achieved when John Kerry was working assiduously with President Barack Obama was that during that era, when we were dealing with Iran, we took the time to bring to the table seasoned diplomats, nuclear scientists, nuclear engineers, people who had a broad understanding of the economy, of global affairs, who knew our place as a nation in the world and who understood very well the global community. Now we have a kind of belligerence that is focused on might, forcing the world into a sense of misguided right, as opposed to what is right, encouraging those who are mighty to adjust to global scenarios. Unfortunately, what was the Soviet Union has been reduced to such a weak state by Russia's ill-conceived war in Ukraine, and the US, which was a major superpower, being lessened and weakened by an ill-conceived war in Iran. So you have two of the superpowers of the world, Russia and the United States of America, both engaged in wars that make no sense, that are disruptive to the global community, and that are exposing the weaknesses of both of these nations. So what was the two leading superpowers, both have been reduced by unguided thought patterns of its leader. So now you have China, which is that third global power, which interestingly enough is sitting back, watching Russia and the US diminish themselves and expose their weaknesses, while China is absorbing influence, not just in Asia, but China is absorbing influence in Africa and in South America. A lot of people are unaware of an organization called BRICS. BRICS stands for Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. At one time, about 12 years ago, those five nations got together and decided that they were going to refocus global attention. And a lot of people ignored BRICS, but I was writing back in 2010 and speaking publicly in 2010 that we need to focus on BRICS. And I was being ignored by a lot of people. And in my last major article in the Ambassador's Review, which is a magazine used to influence global thought and is sent to every member of Congress, to every member of the administration, I was talking about BRICS at that time. And interestingly enough, BRICS not only includes South Africa, it includes Egypt now, it includes Ethiopia. It is expanding rapidly in the African continent and in the rest of the world. So China is using BRICS to reshape global focus and global attention, while Russia and the US are engaged in unwise, unthought out wars that are doing nothing but dismantling global focus and exposing weaknesses of those two great nations.
I want to thank you for sharing. I never heard of BRICS. I encourage my listeners. You talked about what you wrote. Is that article, what you wrote, is that accessible online anywhere?
It's very accessible. The Ambassador's Review is the major publication of the American Council on Ambassadors. And it's designed for a specific audience of diplomats and policymakers. But it is accessible if a person were to Google the Ambassador's Review, the American Council on Ambassadors, and you can look at, in fact, I published 3 times in the Ambassador's Review, but the most recent was in 2024. And I'll send you that offline, a copy of that, in fact.
Thank you so much for that. You spoke about the African continent, and I want to get back to the African continent, especially as someone like myself who have I haven't had the opportunity to visit the continent. Can you talk about your experience with your time there, respectively, in the African Union and Tanzania? And if you could crystallize for us, what is your fondest moment and your most challenging moment as a U.S. ambassador?
Okay. During the time that I was in Ethiopia, I had the opportunity to serve as U.S. ambassador to the African Union, which is the body similar to the European Union. With the African Union, all 55 nations on the African continent are solving and settling their issues through the African Union. So that is the global organization for policy making on the African continent. And during the last 3 years of my 4 years in Ethiopia, I was also assigned, thanks to Secretary Clinton, to be the U.S. representative to the largest United Nations body on the African continent, and that is the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, the UNECA. As a part of the UNECA, I was able to focus on the economic issues that's facing the African continent. And interestingly enough, the African Union, the UNECA, have collaboratively worked on what is called Africa 2063. Africa 2063 was conceptualized in 2013, where the African Union was looking at the 50 years prior to 2013, which is when the OAU, the Organization of African Unity, was founded, and then projecting from 2013 to 2063, 50 years ahead. And in that Africa 2063 document, which I was actually able to engage as it was being developed, the African Union has conceptualized that by 2063, the major geographical regions of the African continent, South, North, East, West, and Central Africa, each of them will have a common market that will respond to all of the nations in that common market, in that geographical region. And Africa will have a continental common market similar to the European continent and its continental common market. There will be a single currency for all of the African continent. That would not replace the currency of individual nations, but it will be a single currency that will be used throughout the African continent. In fact, now many African countries have gotten rid of the requirement for Africans to have a visa to move from one country to the next country. So you can travel now throughout the African continent quite freely, when at one time it was difficult to go from Kenya to Tanzania, from Tanzania to Kenya to Uganda, or any of the other parts of East Africa. Now, all of those nations, you can travel throughout the nations without having to go through a separate visa concept. And in the EAC, which is the 8 countries that make up the East African community, and I was the U.S. representative to the EAC during the time that I was simultaneously the U.S. ambassador to Tanzania. The EAC will have a common currency probably within the next 10 to 15 years, well in advance of 2063. The African Union has the potential to become one of the most powerful global bodies on the planet. There are more members in the United Nations General Assembly from Africa than any other continent. The African continent is now the only continent that has continued rapid growth in population. In fact, the United Nations has already projected that by 2035, 1 out of every 4 people on planet Earth under the age of 35 will be an African. 1 out of every 4 persons on planet Earth under 35 will be an African. And I don't know if you recall this, but back when I was the executive vice president at the Freedom Center in Cincinnati, the business community in Cincinnati, which was predominantly white, asked me to address them. And I was saying to them, I said, you know, it is quite interesting that some predominantly white organizations in the US and in other parts of the world have a difficulty with diversity and integration. I said to them back in 2015, because I left the Freedom Center at the end of 2016, that in the future, whether you know it or not, those who follow you in business will inevitably have to deal with an African, because the US population is shrinking. Asia's population is shrinking. Europe's population is shrinking. The only population that is growing with young people who are being educated formally and who are being aggressive in the business community is the African continent. So whether you, I said to them, whether you have dealt with an African or not, your children and your grandchildren will inevitably know African people, because 1 out of every 4 people on planet Earth by 2035 who are under the age of 35 years of age will be an African. There's no way in the world that the global economy is going to be able to survive without Africa's engagement. And in addition to that, all of the resources necessary for the 21st and 22nd century to survive are on the African continent. You cannot have battery-operated vehicles without the kind of natural and raw material that is on the African continent. You need graphite on the African continent. You need what makes a lithium battery. Lithium batteries are more graphite than they are lithium. And the basic resource is on the African continent. Much of the gold reserve, much of the oil, much of the natural gas that is yet to be explored is on the African continent. So Europe is investing heavily in Africa. China is investing heavily in Africa. Brazil and major countries in South America are investing heavily in Africa. The U.S., with our absent-minded, regressive, racist orientation, is moving away from Africa because we have failed to see the strategic value of the African continent. And I'm hoping that the next Congress and the next leadership in the executive branch of this government will recognize that Africa must be a strategic partner in order for us to move forward. Now, one other point on that. The African Union has 5 geographical areas, as I referred to before. But the African Union back in 2013, 2014 also decided that the entirety of the African diaspora creates the 6th region of the African continent. So people of African descent all over the world, that includes you, Chris, that includes me, that includes blacks in Europe and people of African descent in Asia and South America, all over the world, we constitute the 6th region of the African continent. So I encourage people of color, we need to stop thinking of ourselves only as Africans living in America or as African Americans. Because when we do that exclusively, I'm not saying we should not think of ourselves as African Americans, because we should, and we are. But we should not think of ourselves exclusively and limited in that vein, because we will always be perceived as a minority. But when we look at ourselves as a part of the African continent, as its 6th region, suddenly we become a part of the majority of the world. And by 2035, we will be in the absolute majority of the world. And we need to think more broadly about who we are and to embrace who we are and to know that even after the Trump administration is over, and after Stephen Miller and Hessek and all of these others who are perpetuating racist ideology, we will still stand. We will not be defeated. We will not be beaten down. We will still be standing. And we will be standing tall and standing strong and standing with integrity, because nothing that they are trying to do to us will destroy us. Slavery did not destroy us. Jim Crow did not destroy us. Pete Hegseth will not destroy us. Donald J. Trump will not destroy us. And Stephen Miller will not destroy us. We will stand and we will survive, and we will be a part of the future of this world in spite of those who try to stop us from being a part of the future.
Dr. Battle, let the church say amen, amen, amen. Pass the collection plate, all that. I mean, everything I was going to talk about. We want to talk about global citizenship and stewardship, but you connected the dots in what you just expressed. 1 out of 4 people in this world, in this global economy, around the globe is African. I think it's just a powerful revelation that I think that we need to hear. And I want to thank you for that perspective. One of the things that we've had a conversation on, and I believe the exhibit you was there when the Nelson Mandela exhibit was. Were you there at that time?
Yeah, I do remember that, because I had talked about the fact that I had met Nelson Mandela personally, and had also met personally Nelson Mandela's predecessor as well as his successor.
Absolutely. So, can you share with us a little bit of what you learned from that relationship in conversations that you've had with Nelson Mandela?
Okay. Well, first, let me go back a little bit. My initial engagement with South Africa I was visiting Israel years ago, and I had been invited to come to South Africa. And I said at that time that I would never go to South Africa until South Africa began to get rid of the shackles of apartheid. Mm-hmm. So when South Africa started emerging toward freedom, I was a vice chairman of the American Committee on Africa, which at that time was one of the largest think tanks on African policy. The African Fund and other African organizations coalesced through the American Committee on Africa. So I was a part of the election observation team led by the American Committee on Africa, and we had the largest private group observing those elections than any other organization at the time. Interestingly enough, Danny Glover was there as a part of another group. Jesse Jackson was there as a part of a group. My group included Al Sharpton, Wyatt T. Walker, the former mayor of New York, Mayor Dinkins, and others, and we were there observing the elections. So on the day of the election, and in South Africa, there were multiple days of election. On one of the days of the election, I happened to be visiting one of the voting areas, and F.W. de Klerk, who was the president of South Africa at the time, had come to cast his vote. And myself, along with a French reporter, whose name, unfortunately, I forget, were given an opportunity to talk with F.W. de Klerk. And I said to Mr. de Klerk, I called the President de Klerk, I said, Mr. President, do you expect to win the election today? His response to me was, winning this election is not what is on my mind. What is on my mind is that I said in my time as president, there will be free and fair, open elections in South Africa. And the only thing I'm focused on is that we are having free and fair, open elections. what that said to me was that F.W. de Klerk wanted Nelson Mandela to emerge as the victor in those elections. He had laid the foundation de Klerk had, alongside of activity with the ANC, to assure that Nelson Mandela would be elected. So when President Mandela was elected, about a year or so later, when he came to New York to go to the United Nations and to meet with others in the U.S., he made his first stop at Canaan Baptist Church in Harlem. And the reason he did so was that he said he wanted to thank the African American community for all of the support that it had given to the ANC and to him, Nelson Mandela, during the time of his 27 years in prison. And Dr. Wyatt T. Walker, who was the president of the board of the American Committee on Africa, and I was the vice chair of the board, Wyatt was the pastor of Canaan Baptist Church. So Nelson Mandela came intentionally to meet with Wyatt T. Walker and myself and others. And I was given the opportunity to be one of the ones who greeted him when he got out of his car and to escort him in. And his Secret Service cracked me up because they were so afraid with him being in Harlem. And they were so concerned. And I said to his Secret Service, I said, look, President Mandela is safer in Harlem than he is in any other place on the planet. I said, nobody in Harlem is going to mess with President Mandela, so y'all need to just chill out a little bit and let him engage with people. And so President Mandela engaged with people, including myself, because his Secret Service discovered that, yeah, he is pretty safe in Harlem. He's going to be okay in Harlem. And then we went into for the private ceremony. And since then, of course, I've had conversation with F.W. de Klerk because President Mandela and de Klerk won the Nobel Prize, Peace Prize, for their efforts in transitioning South Africa. And he and de Klerk deserved the Peace Prizes that they won. And I said so to President de Klerk in Ethiopia at a meeting. I said, Mr. President, you probably don't recall the conversation I had with you on election day back in 1994, but I do want to assure you that I am so proud of what you had done and what President Mandela did to try to get South Africa moving forward. And I had the opportunity to work very closely with Thabo Mbeki, who was the second president of South Africa, and less closely, but still somewhat with the third president of South Africa, who President Zuma, his wife one of his former wives became the chairperson of the African Union. So I worked very closely with Madam Zuma and worked somewhat with President Jacob Zuma during the time that he was at the African Union.
It is amazing. The people that you've met during your lifetime, that to have conversations. I just want to ask, we're going to thank you for taking this time. And before we get out of here, if you could share with us, you've already given us a perspective that is needed when we talk about global citizenship. What would you like to share with us at this time that we need to be thinking about as we navigate our current circumstances here in this nation, but also what we should be doing to have more of a global mindset versus a neighborhood, state, and even national mindset to move us forward? Any final words?
I would say that we should look at ourselves as a part of the global community. The world cannot function without collaboration and cooperation. And we are a major part of the present and the future of shaping this planet. And if you really want to be technical about it, God, in God's great wisdom, created humanity on the African continent. When you look at the Genesis story started on the African continent. And the fact that we are a part of that, not just because we are people from African descent and can trace our lineage to Africa, but because we are part of the human family. It is our job to not be distracted by the nonsense and the loud chatter that is coming from 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue at the moment. We are to look beyond the moment and to see ourselves in a global and eternal context. And when we do that, we discover that nobody can defeat us unless we bend our backs and allow ourselves to be defeated. Martin King often said that nobody can ride your back if you don't bend it. Nobody can defeat us if we do not yield to allow ourselves to be defeated. And too many people get locked in the moment as opposed to seeing ourselves as a part of God's grand design for the human family and the human experience. And if we are cooperative and collaborative, we are broad-minded enough to make room for those who cannot trace their lineage directly to the African continent, as many of us can. You know, one of the things that South Africans taught us, when Mandela became president, he could have done a complete reverse and said, I'm going to criticize and ostracize all these white people who treated me badly. No, he didn't do that. He embraced and said, let's move forward collaboratively and collectively as a nation. Now, I'm hoping that South Africa will become what Nelson Mandela wanted it to become. And South Africa is beginning to make those transitions now that it has the ANC being more broad in its orientation and having more of a coalition in the governance of South Africa. So we as a people are part of God's global design, and we are a part of the African continent, which makes us not the minority. We are the majority. And when we think that way, and when we know that we are the majority and we will not oppress others simply because we are part of a majority, it makes us more able to be used in God's grand design for the world.
We are the majority. Well, sir, Dr. Battle, you are indeed a scholar and a gentleman and a brilliant example of humanity. I just want to thank you for taking the time to share your perspective with us, to share your wisdom with us. You make these amazing posts on social media that provoked me to ask you to come to the Got Time table virtually, that is. I want to thank you so much. Thank you for your service. Thank you for your leadership. And thank you for your time.
Well, thank you, Chris, and peace be with you and your family and to your audience as well.
Thank you. Dr. Battle has experienced the very stewardship he calls each of us to. From decades spent building bridges across the African continent, Dr. Battle has shown us what it looks like to belong to the whole world, not just one corner of it. Nelson Mandela once reminded us that our human compassion binds us to one another. So as you go about your time, ask yourself, what does it mean for you to be a citizen of the world? Stay curious, stay engaged, and remember, the world is smaller and more connected than we think. I am your scholar and gentleman in a hoodie. Know thy history.